Hi everyone, I'm Kiana Adams from the Key Ingredients, sitting here in my lovely seating area. We're going to be teaching you manual mode today. Manual mode. Woo. Once you try manual mode and you start to perfect it, I promise you, you will never go back. So if that sounds good to you, keep watching. All right, let's get started. But before we do, I want to reintroduce myself. For those who are new, I'm Kiana Adams for the Key Ingredient. I am a food photographer and educator, recipe developer. And when I'm not developing content for myself, I'm providing content here on my channel just for you on all things photography, tips and tricks and all that jazz. Also, remember to subscribe to my channel by hitting the notification bell and follow me on Instagram at the Key Ingredient. Intro. Today, I'm going to teach you about the 3 elements that you have to use in order to achieve proper exposure in your photographs: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Each of these features has a specific function and are responsible for creating a certain look and various styles, especially when it comes to your food photography. Aperture is controlled by the lens and is measured by the f-stop scale. The f-stops can go from 1.8 to 1.4 all the way up to 22. So that's a wide range. One thing that you should note about aperture is that the lower the number, say a number 1, is wide. It's as wide as you can get. Imagine a cat's eye at night when it's just wide and they look really doughy-eyed. All the way to 22, which is like so tiny. So imagine when a cat is outside and you see their pupil and it's like really slit thin. That's a really small aperture, but that's also a higher number on the f-stop scale. So from 1 to 22, 1 being the largest and most wide open, all the way to 22 being like a tiny little sliver. The wider the aperture, the more shallow depth of field. And that's where we get those like dreamy images where the subject is in focus and crisp and tack sharp, but everything in the foreground and the background is out of focus and blurry, or you get those nice bokeh elements and lights and things like that. On the opposite end, when the aperture is tighter and smaller, hence or higher number, then you get a wider depth of field, a longer depth of field. So that means that everything in the foreground, your subject, and the background is going to be in focus. So depending on the look that you're going for, you can decide what depth of field you'd like. Now for me, if I'm doing a straight on, I like to have a shallower depth of field. So I'm going to shoot at a 2.8 or 1.4 or something so that I make sure that my subject is tack sharp. But if I'm doing a flat lay and I have varying levels, I want everything on that flat lay to be in focus. So I'm going to tighten my aperture a little bit. So I'm going to bring it up maybe to an f8, depending on my lighting conditions, because I want everything from the lens all the way down to the floor to be in focus. And the depth of field doesn't really go that far, depending on your aperture, but I want to make sure that everything from where I focus, slightly above and below, are in focus, especially for a flat lay. So as a quick exercise, if you have your camera on you, all right, I want you to put it into live mode. And as you have it in live mode, I want you to play with the aperture a little bit. Choose a subject. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. A water bottle, your purse, a wallet, a bag of flour, whatever it is that you have at your disposal. And I want you to start playing with the aperture. Take a couple of shots with the aperture super wide as it can get, depending on the camera that you have. And then go all the way and make the aperture super small and see what the image looks like, okay? We're doing this in manual mode, and depending on what you have your camera settings on, your camera may be a little, or your image rather, may be a little super bright or really dark, but we're gonna get to that. Next, we're moving on to shutter speed, and shutter speed and aperture are partners. They go hand in hand. They work to balance each other. And honestly, that's what it's really about. It's about balance. Shutter speed is the length of time that the shutter is open. And shutter speed really works with motion and blur. So depending on how fast or slow your shutter is opening and closing will determine if you get those blurred effects, if that's what you're going for, or if you actually stop motion, which is another effect, and depending on what you're shooting. And this is because when the shutter opens up really quickly, it can stop motion. But if you're shooting natural light photography and you're doing something in your kitchen, doing a flat lay, you're not really going for freezing action. Sometimes, depends on what you're shooting. You want to make sure that you capture as much light into the lens. So you're going to have that aperture open up and then close down a little bit more slowly, especially if you're not using strobes. A fast shutter speed freezes action because it opens for a fraction of a second, whereas a slower shutter speed blurs motion because it opens up for a longer period of time. So for me, if I'm shooting handheld in a low light situation, I never shoot below 1/80th of a second because I want to still maintain some action or motion in my shots. And if you're hand holding, then you could cause lens blur and not get those tack sharp images that you really want and that really define a nice sharp quality image. When considering what shutter speed to use, you need to think about your situation, what you're shooting, who you're shooting, how you're shooting. And this is really going to determine how fast or how slow your shutter speed should be. If you're going to be capturing a drizzle or a sprinkle or some sort of splash and you want to freeze the action, you need to make sure that your shutter speed is fast. Otherwise, you're going to get that kind of blurred effect. And if that's what you're going for, then great. But if you want to freeze the action, you have to open that shutter speed for a fraction of a second. My tip is experiment. When you go into your shoot and you start using manual mode, think about what it is that you want to capture. And then you think about, okay, if I'm trying to freeze the action, I need a faster shutter speed. And if I want to show blur, I need a slower shutter speed. Or I'm shooting something that's not moving, I'm using natural light, so I think I need to slow down the shutter speed. And this is why. When you slow down the shutter speed, as it works with the aperture, it opens up, but it's letting light in. And so the more light you let in, it exposes the sensor, and a faster shutter speed lets less light onto your sensor, which can produce darker images. So as you experiment, make sure that you play around with the different shutter speeds to see how can I stop motion, but get a properly exposed image. And that may be that you have to open your aperture a little bit wider and compensate for that fast shutter speed. So it's all about balance here. We have to open up something wider to make something faster and stop motion, or we can close it down a little tighter and make the shutter speed go a little bit slower so it can let more light in. I got somebody calling me on my phone. ISO. Now this one I really enjoy, and it does make a difference for me, especially when I was shooting events. But nowadays, as I'm shooting food, I don't shoot above 100 ISO, and really the range for me is like about 100 to 400 depending. But if you plan on trying to print your images, you really don't want to go above 400 ISO. However, there are some cases where you just can't help it. There's not enough light in your kitchen and you really need higher ISO. And I'm going to explain why. ISO controls light sensitivity. So changing the ISO on your camera when you're in manual mode can drastically brighten or darken your photos. ISO is metered by film speeds, which range from 100 to 3200 in most digital DSLRs. And so when you're picking a film speed, there are some general rules that I'm going to explain to you, but for starters, think about 100 ISO like tight, firm sand, and light, we'll say it's water. If you're going to pour water over that firmly packed sand, it's going to take a long time for it to seep down to the bottom, for it to get through those tightly packed granules, right? So think of the water as light. You need more light. It's going to take more time for the light to really, really, really get in and expose that sensor. On the opposite end, 2000 ISO, think about it like big chunky rocks. You pour water over that, it's just going straight down to the bottom. It doesn't need as much to get through. That's what film sensitivity is like. 100, really tight grain, really, really, really fine. Your images, they're not going to be as pixelated. The chromatic abrasion is not going to be as intense, and you're going to have some really, really, really nice fine images. However, it's going to take a lot of light, and it's probably going to take slower shutter speeds to get on that sensor and actually expose that image. Whereas 400, 800, 1200 on up, just think about the grains getting larger, 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 larger until they're big boulders. It takes less light to expose that film. So you have a little bit more wiggle room. Your apertures don't have to be as big, and your shutter speeds don't have to be as slow to expose the sensor. So just know, if you're using a lower ISO speed, then you're going to have to spend a little bit more time working with the shutter speed. It's going to have to slow down significantly, and you may have to open up your aperture wider. If you're working with a higher ISO, just know that you'll have a little bit more wiggle room. So when you think about it, this is why most portrait photographers will shoot at 100 ISO. And essentially, as a food photographer, we're shooting still life, and we really want those fine details to come through. And most sensors, even at 400, you still get a nice fine grain, but 100 is the finest, especially on a DSLR. Now it's time for you to experiment. When I think about this, and I know I'm probably dating myself, I learned to drive on a manual transmission, and there were so many things to think about: shifting back and forth, driving, braking, your clutch, all of that. This is kind of like that, but it's more fun and not as scary. While you experiment, I want you to set a variable. Let's say that your variable is you're going to shoot at 100 ISO, and you're going to do an aperture of 2.8. Okay, so those are the things that cannot change. You want to have a shallow depth of field. That is your focus. So now the thing that's going to have to compensate for those two things is shutter speed. Exactly. Now say you want to capture an action shot, and you really want that drizzle of that honey or that syrup, and you know that the shutter speed has to capture the action, so it has to be faster. That's right. So now you have to compensate with your aperture. As you experiment, remember to pick a constant, and that's really what I'm asking you to do here. You play with it a little bit, and that's how you start to grow. Pick your constant and then add in your variables. So you know what your aperture is going to be for a shallow depth of field or for a longer depth of field. Now let's place in our shutter speed. If we're going to keep our ISO at 100 always, then that's always going to be a constant. And so if you get to a place where you have all of your aperture in place and your shutter speed in place, and it's exactly where you want it, but your image keeps coming out really underexposed or very dark, then you're going to have to give yourself a little bit of leeway and up that ISO. So that way you can get a properly exposed image. And I would recommend, before you set up a full shoot, shoot things around your house. Just things around your home that don't need any fixing up, that have depth and wrinkles and, you know, coils and all these different things, whether it's cords or bowls or your bag, and then really get to play with these elements before you spend time cooking and setting up and doing all these things. Then you get a really firm grasp on how all of these elements work together. And then you can go on and move into your shoots feeling more confident about the process. All right, guys, are you ready for manual mode? What are your questions? What has been the biggest hang up or obstacle that you've experienced since you've started or attempted to shoot manual? Leave a comment in the comment sections. I want to know, and if I can assist, I'll definitely answer you back. If you happen to be watching this on my blog, please leave a comment below. I would love to hear your answers to these questions, and if I can help, I'll most certainly try. All right, guys, that wraps it up for me. I'm Kiana Adams, food photographer, educator, and recipe developer. I want you guys to experiment. That's my main goal and my hope for all of you watching this video. Experiment, experiment, experiment. Go around your house. Don't produce a large shoot. Just shoot things around before you invest and go crazy in your home studio, okay? If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell, and remember to follow me on Instagram at The Key Ingredient. Thank you guys again for watching. I'm Kiana Adams, and I will catch you on the next video. Stay blessed. All right, we're rolling. Let me pull up my script. Beep, 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 beep. Sounds. I promise that your set will fall all over you if you're not watching. Okay, shutter speed, using that.